Hi guys, Brian from Brian Boas here. Caulker Cay and Caulker Cay boas are two wonderful dwarf boas from small islands off the coast of Belize. Today I'm going to explain the similarities and differences between these two closely related forms of dwarf boa, as well as give some tips for the best way to keep and breed these wonderful mini boas. So to start with, I have a Caulker Cay right here and a Caulker Cay right here in my right hand. And as you can see, superficially they're fairly similar animals. Both of them have this almost anerythristic appearance with mostly grays and blacks and whites, very little as far as red or yellow pigments. You know, some people have said, well, they're not truly anerythristic because sometimes they have a little bit of red. But, you know, even other aneries sometimes have a little bit. So I would say that they're naturally occurring forms of anerythristic boa. These are also two adult males, as you can see. The other characteristic is the size. They're both about 4 feet long. They're both, well, this one's a proven breeder. This one, hopefully this year, he'll have his first litter. These guys, I believe this is a 2016. This is a 2017. So they're not going to get any bigger than this. And, you know, and these have gotten really popular lately because people are just attracted to a smaller boa that they can keep in a smaller space, and the care is a little simpler, but they still have all the great behaviors of boa constrictors. But, you know, they're no bigger than a corn snake or king snake, or not even as big as some ball pythons actually, as far as the mass of these guys. But just great animals to work with. As I mentioned, they're both from these small islands called Keys or Cays, spelled C-A-Y. And these are just small islands off the coast of Belize where, you know, thousands of years ago, the ancestors that started these populations somehow made it to these islands, and then they bred, and the result was this smaller form of boa that doesn't need as much food. You know, there's not a lot of food resources on these islands, so there was evolutionary selection pressure to evolve to a smaller size, and these guys are smaller and more anery looking than the mainland cousins that live in mainland Belize. So looking at them, again, they're pretty similar superficially, and I actually had Caulker Cay first. I wasn't even planning to get the Caulker Cay, but a good buddy of mine was getting out of boas and had a pair that needed a home, so I got them, and I'm really happy that I got them because as I've been keeping them over the years, I've really begun to appreciate you know, the differences between these two. So in general, the Caulker Cay has kind of more of a massive body, whereas the Caulker Cay is a little bit slimmer and more elongated. They're both quite squeezy and strong, but I'd have to say that the Caulker Cay is a little bit stronger because they've got the thicker bodies and they just like to hold on. And then the other difference is that the Caulker Cay in general tend to have more uniform, consistent markings. They don't vary nearly as much in their pattern, and they have these, you know, pretty similarly shaped dark saddles, not peaked, kind of blocky looking. Whereas the Caulker Cay has more variability in the pattern. You can have striping, you can have aberrant saddles, you can have more uniform saddles. They just vary a little bit more. When I first got into locality boas and I was studying all the pictures I could get in the books and online of the different localities, I really didn't see all that much of a difference between the two. You know, and as I mentioned, overall they are similar, but you know, they are definitely distinct differences, and the more that you see these animals and work with them, the more you appreciate the differences. And I'm really happy that I got this guy. I bred these Caulker Cays for the first time last year, had a really nice litter. Some of you guys probably have some of the babies, hope they're doing well. Caulker Cay I've bred several times before. This is actually one of my offspring from 2017, and hopefully I'll have some more babies this year, so fingers crossed. My breeding trials are actually still going on. I'm pretty confident my female is gravid, but you know, I'd just like to wait a little longer, keep the male in with her just to be absolutely sure. So these guys, as I mentioned, they're dwarfs. As far as keep caring for them, they're pretty simple to care for. You know, the same environmental conditions and husbandry of any other boa. I would say in general they're a little more forgiving as far as their husbandry. They were formerly classified as Boa Constrictor Imperator. Now they're classified as Boa Imperator. Some people think that they're sufficiently different that they should be a different subspecies from the mainland boas, or even a different species. And they're quite rare in the wild. In fact, as far as the population on Caulker Cay Island, some people have estimated that there might be as few as 8 animals remaining in the wild, which is actually about the same number that I have in my collection, which is fairly shocking. But if you're interested in reading about the biology of these animals, there's a lot of really good papers published by Dr. Scott Boback that you can get online, and he goes into the studying the evolution of these 2 different animals and how they compare to mainland boas as well. There's a line of mainland boas from mainland Belize that were actually collected by him in the Belize City dump. And there's actually a National Geographic episode from about, 20 years ago that shows him collecting these boas. And so if you have some of these mainland Belize boas, and they're quite rare, but I know at least a few of you guys have them, you can actually watch the collection of the founder animals on this National Geographic episode. So just a really cool, fact to consider. I don't have the mainland Belize. My buddy I got these from, the Caulkers, actually had mainland Belize. I wish I had acquired them, but I didn't. So I don't have them. But at least I've got these 2 really great dwarf crawl boas, the Caulker Cay and the Caulker Cay. I've really enjoyed breeding my Cay boas over the years and have been growing up my breeding group. These are actually 2 holdbacks from 2020, and just gives you an idea about some of the variability in the patterns of these animals. This is a male, this is a female, who, this female actually just shed, so she's looking really nice. And one of the things about this female that you notice is she's got quite a bit of striping, especially towards her tail. You can see that long stripe there. But then she's also got quite a few saddles that are fused, 2 or 3 saddles fused to make a partial stripe. This male has kind of more of a typical pattern, though some striping as well. And you just get much more variability in the patterns. The color of the Caulker Cays is lighter in general than the Caulker Cays. And this female, you can see how light she looks. A lot of them have this kind of beautiful, kind of more of a lavender gray. There's a little bit of purple in there as well. I don't know if that's coming through on the camera with this female. But the Caulker Cay in general is just kind of more of a darker color. And the saddles are bigger and blockier, and just a kind of a darker appearance overall. So these guys are now going on 3 years old. Probably a couple more years before they're ready to breed. They're not going to get too much bigger than this. They're probably, maybe a little over 3 feet at this point. But they're real easy to grow, doing well. I feed these guys about every 2 weeks or so, a little bit less than my other subadults. But one thing I will mention is that the babies can be a little bit tricky to get feeding sometimes on frozen thawed. Typically I don't have a huge problem getting them onto live mice, although there's always a few that don't want to eat the live mice, and I end up having to assist feed them. But almost all of them will start feeding within a couple months. But then sometimes they're a little bit tricky to get onto the frozen thawed. You might kind of dangle the frozen thawed rodent in front of them, they take it, but then they realize it's not alive and they spit it out, and you got to do that again and again, and it kind of gets a little bit annoying. These guys are now all eating frozen thawed, but my other female I held back was a little picky, and until she got to be about 2 years old, she was kind of had to coax her to eat the frozen thawed. Sometimes I just gave up and gave her a live one. As far as breeding, they're pretty simple to breed. Just the standard conditioning you use to breed any other boa works pretty well. Just a slight temperature drop in the fall, you pair them up, keep them together for a few months, and if things go well, you'll have some babies, over the summer. Typically, they're almost always born in July or early August. One thing I will say is that I've been getting comments on, how do you pronounce Cay or K, spelled C-A-Y. As far as I can tell from all my research, the most correct way to pronounce it is Cay, like a key that opens a lock. And I believe that most of the people that live on these islands pronounce it that way. I have had some people write to me, no, it's K. I don't, you say it however you want. This is really not something that makes sense to really get up in arms about. So if you want to call it a Caulker Cay boa, most people are going to know what you're talking about. I'll continue to call them Caulker Cay boas. I've also seen it spelled C-A-Y-E. I've also seen the K first, like K Caulker rather than Caulker Cay. So again, it's just in some cases personal preference, but I do believe the most correct way to pronounce it based on my research is Cay. Back to the Caulker Cays. This is my adult female, and this is the one I paired up with the male that I showed you a few scenes ago. The point I wanted to make is she's pretty similar overall to the male. The pattern is very similar, the color is very similar, the size is very similar. I'd have to say she's maybe a little bit more yellowy brown, whereas the male's a little more steel gray, but it's really, really subtle. And in fact, sometimes I find them hard to tell apart. I have to look at the tail to see which one is the male and which one is the female. But these are, great boas. They have a really good hand feel. So how I call it, when you take them out and they sit in your hand, it's a really nice feeling. They're kind of beefy. They're quite thick. They're quite strong. But you're talking about a 4-foot animal, so it's not going to really be able to do any kind of damage, or it can't do anything like a large true redtail can. But it's got the same type of muscle tone, which is quite a nice combination. And then I like how they're kind of more chill. They don't really take off like some other snakes do. I guess that's pretty typical for a lot of boas, that they're more chill than other snakes. But just a great species to work with. And then another plus is you can keep them in smaller enclosures in general. Like a 4-foot enclosure is fine for pretty much all adults. Rarely they will get over 5.5 feet. I guess if you had like a giant one, you should put it in an enclosure like that. And in fact, these boa tubs, these are the Vision boa tubs for the 40 by 30 inch tubs. These are great for adults, and I keep a lot of mine in these homemade racks that have these Vision boa tubs. You want to feed these fairly sparingly. My adults are fed about once every 2 to 3 weeks. The babies about once every 2 weeks or so, which I guess isn't that much different from my other boas. But I did see a kind of a disturbing video on YouTube where someone had power fed a Caulker Cay boa, and it was like morbidly obese. It was like really, really thick. It looked like it was probably about 6 or 7 feet long. So I think if you did feed these guys a lot, they could potentially get bigger, but they probably wouldn't last very long because they've evolved to take on these smaller sizes. So it can't be good for their for their heart and the rest of their body to have to deal with this much more massive body size from all these constant feedings. So please don't power feed these guys. One of the nice things about them is that they tend to be a nice low maintenance pet. They give you a lot of the great pet boa experience, but in general they're more simple and straightforward to keep than many other boas. Finally, I wanted to show you guys some babies from last year for both the Caulker Cay and the Caulker Cay, and I was lucky to have litters of both in 2022. I held back a few and they're doing really, really well. So these guys are now about 9 months old. So taking a look at them, you can see the Caulker Cay. The obvious difference is that this one has much more distinctive markings. You can see how crisp the saddles are. She's a little nippy. Versus the Caulker Cay, the saddles are a little more irregular, a little more muted, a little more washed out looking. And the color of the Caulker Cay overall is a little bit darker than the Caulker Cay. So you saw she got a little nippy. The babies can be a little bit nippy for the first year or so. I've seen that more actually with the Caulker Cay, although my experience with the Caulker Cay is just limited to the one litter. But these Caulker Cays in general have been a little more laid back than the Caulker Cays. Although some of the Caulker Cays are fine, so it's obviously a individual difference. And they're doing real well. I still have them eating live, although sometimes I can get them to take a frozen thaw just by dangling it. But it gets a little old after you have to go back a few times. I'm just going to keep her at arm's length so she doesn't do any damage. It's kind of comical actually, because she could just easily turn her head and bite my thumb, but I guess it hasn't figured that one out. So I don't have any Caulker Cay breedings this year. I just have my one pair that I'm giving in the year off. I do have Caulker Cay breeding right now, and fingers crossed on a litter. Probably sometime in July it'll be born, but we'll just have to see. As far as the litter sizes, they don't have huge litters, anywhere from probably about half a dozen to maybe a dozen and a half. I think my Caulker Cay litters are typically about a dozen. I believe I had 9 of these Caulker Cays. And just great animals to work with. You know, looking at these next to each other, I have to say that I really like this Caulker Cay. And you know, if I had to pick a favorite, I would have to say I like the Caulker Cay a little bit better just because of how beautiful the pattern is, and just I also like handling them. They're kind of thicker, stockier than these Caulker Cay, but it's really slight, you know, and another day I might think that Caulker Cay is my favorite, so don't quote me on that. You know, you can't really go wrong with either of these if you're able to find them. So anyway, that's a little bit about the Dwarf Cay Boas. Hope you enjoyed the video. If you have any questions or comments, feel free to shoot me a line. Thanks for watching and enjoy your Boas.